The House That Remembers Trial. Episode. The house stood at the very edge of the village, a skeletal thing of rotting wood and sagging beams, hunched against the creeping grasp of ivy and time. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember, a fixture of whispered warnings and childhood dares. The villagers did not go near it after dark. They did not talk about the way its windows sometimes glowed with a sickly light, or how those who strayed too close swore they heard something moving inside, shifting behind the cracked walls. They simply pretended it wasn't there. Daniel, however, didn't have that luxury. He stood at the rusted gate, staring up at the place that was now supposed to be his home. His stomach twisted, though he couldn't say exactly why. The house was old, sure, and run down, but he had seen worse. His mother had always been good at making things livable. She had no choice. After his father's death, they had moved from place to place, always searching for something cheap, something temporary, something that wouldn't remind them of what they'd lost. Still, as he took his first hesitant step toward the porch, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this house was different. It wasn't just abandoned. It felt aware. The arrival. "Are you sure this is safe?" Emma asked, hugging herself as she stood beside him. His little sister had been quiet for most of the drive, her usual energy dulled by the weight of change. "It's old," Daniel admitted, glancing up at the warped roof. "But it's not fallen apart or anything." Emma didn't look convinced. "It smells weird." Their mother, already unlocking the front door with a forced cheerfulness, sighed. "It just needs some air. It's been closed up for a long time, that's all." She pushed the door open, revealing a dark hallway lined with aged wallpaper that had curled at the edges. The air that rushed out was thick, carrying the scent of dust, damp wood, and something else, something faintly metallic. Daniel stepped inside first. The floor groaned beneath his weight, as though waking from a long sleep. The ceiling was high, the walls adorned with faded floral patterns, and old furniture sat beneath dust-covered sheets like forgotten ghosts. Emma lingered on the doorstep. "I don't like it," she muttered. Their mother turned to her with a tired smile. "Give it a chance, sweetheart. We'll make it nice." But Daniel noticed the way her hands tightened around her purse strap, the way her eyes flickered toward the dim hallway ahead, as though she, too, felt something was off. They spent the rest of the afternoon airing out the rooms, pulling down sheets, wiping away years of neglect. The house resisted them, creaking and shifting with every movement, as if reluctant to let them settle in. By the time evening fell, exhaustion outweighed unease, but the house wasn't done introducing itself. The first night Daniel awoke to the sound of Emma screaming. His heart lurched as he threw off the covers and bolted down the hallway. "Emma!" he called, bursting into her room. She was sitting up in bed, her breath ragged, fingers digging into the blanket. Her wide, tear-filled eyes were fixed on the farthest corner of the room. "Emma, what's wrong?" he asked, rushing to her side. For a long moment, she didn't respond. She just stared, unblinking, her body trembling. Then, in a whisper so soft he almost didn't hear it, she said, "There was someone in the room." Daniel stiffened. "What?" She swallowed hard. "Over there." She pointed to the shadowed corner by the wardrobe. "I saw them, just standing there watching me." His gaze followed her finger, but there was nothing. Just a darkened patch of wallpaper, the old wooden floor, the familiar outline of the wardrobe. "You were dreaming," he said, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. Emma shook her head violently. "Number, it wasn't a dream. They were there." Daniel hesitated before standing up and stepping toward the corner. The floor was cold beneath his feet, the air oddly heavy. He reached out, fingers brushing against the rough wallpaper. Nothing. "See?" he said, forcing a small smile. "No one's here." Emma didn't look convinced, but she let him tuck her back in. "Keep the light on?" she whispered. "Yeah," Daniel said. "Of course." He stayed with her until her breathing evened out, until sleep finally took her. Then slowly he crept back to his own room. But as he climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to his chin, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had noticed them. And it was waiting. The second night, Daniel wasn't sure what woke him. Maybe it was the cold. It crept beneath the blankets, sinking into his bones, despite the layers of warmth. Or maybe it was the house itself. He had never lived anywhere so loud. Even now, in the dead of night, the floorboards shifted with phantom footsteps. The wind whistled through unseen cracks. The walls gave off soft, rhythmic pops, like an old house exhaling. But there was something else, a sound that didn't belong. Creak. Daniel's pulse quickened. It had come from the hallway. He held his breath, listening. Creak. Slow, deliberate, too heavy to be the house settling. He turned onto his side, eyes locked on his bedroom door. It was slightly ajar just as he had left it. Creak. The sound moved closer. Then silence. A long, stretched silence that made his skin prickle. Daniel's breathing grew shallow, his ears strained for any sign of movement. Then just outside his door, a whisper. Low, hoarse, inhuman. "Let me in." Chapter 4. The shadow in the hallway. Daniel's breath hitched in his throat. His fingers curled into the fabric of his blanket, his body rigid with fear. He wanted to believe it was his imagination, that exhaustion was playing tricks on him. But then, the whisper came again, closer. "Let me in!" The voice was unlike anything he had ever heard. It was not just hoarse, but layered, as though multiple voices were speaking in unison, each one slightly out of sync. It sent a crawling sensation up his spine, an instinctual terror that rooted him in place. The door creaked, shifting slightly as if something had pressed against it from the other side. A single, drawn-out exhale seeped through the crack, thick with the scent of decay, like damp earth, and something far worse. Something rotten. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to remain still. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run, to throw the blanket over his head like a child hiding from the monsters under his bed. But deep down, he knew this was no childhood nightmare. This was real. The whisper came again, this time slower, more deliberate. "Let me in." A faint tapping followed, a soft, rhythmic knock against the wood of his door. It wasn't the sharp rap of knuckles, but something more unnatural, as though fingertips, too long and too thin, were drumming patiently against the surface. Waiting. Daniel's heart pounded. He considered calling out to his mother, to Emma, but something deep inside him warned against it. A primitive, unshakable certainty told him that acknowledging the presence outside his door would be a mistake. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the knocking ceased. The whispering stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Daniel strained to hear, every muscle in his body coiled with tension. Had it left? Was it still standing just outside? The air felt heavy, pressing down on him like a physical weight. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears, the uneven rhythm of his own breath. Then, a slow, deliberate creak. Not from the door. From inside the room, something was in there with him. Chapter 5. The presence in the room. Daniel's breath hitched. His pulse pounded in his ears loud enough that he almost couldn't hear anything else. Almost. The creak came again, closer, the sound of wood bending beneath deliberate, measured weight. Not the irregular pops of an old house settling, but something purposeful, something moving. He lay frozen, his back damp with sweat against the mattress. His hands clutched the blanket, fingers curled so tightly the fabric bunched between them. He didn't dare move. The air in the room felt different now. Wrong. It was thick, heavy, pressing down on his chest like an unseen hand. The temperature had dropped, a deep, unnatural chill that didn't belong in the stale warmth of a summer night. It wasn't just cold. It was the kind of cold that settled in bones that belonged to places forgotten by the sun. Then came the scent. Faint at first, a whisper of something damp, something old. But with each second it grew stronger, a sickly, cloying stench of rotting wood, damp earth, and something more putrid, the unmistakable stench of decay. A whisper drifted through the silence. "I see you." Daniel's entire body seized. The voice wasn't his imagination. It wasn't the wind slipping through the cracks in the house. It was real. And worse, it was close. Too close. The breath that carried the words was warm and wet against his ear, as if someone was leaning over him, inches from his face. But there was no one there. He fought the instinct to bolt, to throw himself off the bed and sprint for the door. He knew that if he moved, if he acknowledged it, something terrible would happen. The floor creaked again. The presence wasn't just standing there anymore. It was circling the bed. Daniel's throat went dry. He strained to listen, to track the invisible weight shifting across the wooden floor. It moved with an unsettling slowness, as if savoring the moment. His breath was shallow, controlled. He forced himself to stay still, to not react. Then, without warning, the blanket shifted. Daniel barely contained a gasp as the covers pulled ever so slightly, the sensation barely noticeable but unmistakable. The whisper of fabric sliding over fabric, a gentle tug, like a child testing the edge of a curtain before pulling it back. His heart slammed against his ribs. Something was standing right beside him, watching, waiting. Then, something wet touched his arm. Not fingers, not a hand. Something colder, slicker, like flesh long past its time. A violent shiver racked through him, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The whisper came again, thick with something almost hungry. "I see you." The blanket tugged harder. Daniel's breath broke. He shot upright with a strangled gasp, shoving himself backward until his shoulders slammed against the headboard. His chest rose and fell in sharp, panicked bursts. His eyes darted wildly across the room. Empty. His door was still ajar just as he had left it. The wardrobe loomed in the corner, its doors slightly misaligned. The old wooden desk, the piles of unpacked boxes, the moonlight spilling through the thin curtains. Everything was exactly as it had been. Except for the lingering chill that wrapped around his body, like unseen fingers. Except for the scent of rot that still clung to his skin. And except for the whisper that echoed in his mind, even now. "I see you." Chapter 6. What lies beneath? The silence in the room felt unnatural, thick, like a living thing. It pressed against Daniel's ears, smothering every sound except the frantic pounding of his heart. His breath came in short, uneven gasps, his chest rising and falling in erratic rhythm. He wanted to believe it was over, that whatever had been in the room with him had left. But deep inside, He knew the truth. It was still there. Watching. Waiting. His fingers trembled as he reached for the bedside lamp, desperate for light. The moment his hand made contact with the switch, the bulb flickered violently, struggling to push back the darkness. Then, population. The room was swallowed in blackness. A sickening dread coiled in his stomach. His pulse thundered in his ears. He clenched his jaw, refusing to let out the terrified sound building in his throat. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It felt alive, as though it carried weight, shifting around him, stretching unseen fingers toward his skin. Then, from the far corner of the room, a breath. Slow, measured, not his. Daniel swallowed hard. He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the sheet so tightly his knuckles ached. Maybe if he ignored it, it would go away. Maybe if he stayed still, it wouldn't see him. Then, the whisper. "You brought me back." Daniel's breath hitched. The voice was lower now, no longer layered but rasping, raw, as though forced through broken vocal cords. "Brought it back?" The words rattled inside his skull. What did that mean? A scraping sound cut through the silence. A slow, deliberate drag against wood, like nails raking across the floor. His stomach twisted. The sound wasn't coming from the far end of the room anymore. It was closer, moving. His breath stilled. He barely dared to open his eyes, but the overwhelming instinct to see overpowered the terror anchoring him in place. Slowly, cautiously, he cracked his eyelids open. Something shifted in the darkness. Not fully visible, but a shape. A distortion in the air, darker than the shadows around it. A hunched, twisted silhouette standing just beyond the foot of his bed. Watching. Waiting. Daniel felt his pulse in his throat. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to move, to run, to do something, but he couldn't. The thing in the shadows had taken that from him. He could only stare, wide-eyed, as it tilted its head. The air around it seemed to vibrate, and then it moved. Not like a person, not even like an animal. The motion was unnatural, its limbs shifting too fluidly, too smoothly, as though it wasn't bound by the same rules of movement as everything else in the world. Daniel's breath came in short, sharp bursts. His mind scrambled for an explanation, for a way out, for anything, but all logic dissolved beneath the crushing weight of dread. Then, the whisper came again. "You shouldn't have come back." Something cold brushed against his ankle. Daniel's body reacted before his brain could process what was happening. With a strangled cry, he kicked out, scrambling backward until his back slammed against the headboard. He yanked his legs up, tucking them beneath him, his entire body shaking violently. His mind screamed at him to run, to bolt out the door, to leave this house and never return. But the whisper came once more, sealing his fate. It's too late. The air around him thickened. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against his skin. And then, from beneath the bed, a hand, pale, elongated fingers stretching toward him, the skin bruised and mottled, as if it had spent far too long buried beneath the earth. Daniel didn't have time to scream before it grabbed him. Chapter 7. The House. That remembers Daniel's scream. Never left his throat. The moment the cold, lifeless fingers wrapped around his ankle, his voice collapsed into a strangled gasp, his body convulsing with raw terror. The grip was impossibly strong, the fingers pressing into his skin like iron shackles. He kicked, thrashed, clawed at the sheets, but the thing beneath the bed pulled. The world tilted. The wooden floor rushed toward him as his body was yanked downward. His nails scraped against the headboard in a desperate attempt to anchor himself, but it was no use. The shadows beneath the bed were no longer just shadows. They were deep, deeper than they should have been, deeper than the floor itself. A void, a gaping maw, hungry, waiting. Daniel's body slid downward, his legs disappearing into the darkness. The cold seeped through his pajama pants, spreading up his spine, suffocating him. And then, the whisper. "You don't belong here." His fingers found the nightstand. With a surge of desperation, he gripped its edge, holding on for dear life. His knuckles turned white, his arms burned with the effort. The thing below pulled harder, a distant sound. A voice, a door creaking open. Daniel, his mother's voice, muffled, sleepy, just beyond the hallway. The thing beneath him stilled. The whisper came again, but softer this time, almost regretful. "You shouldn't have come back." Then, as suddenly as it had grabbed him, it let go. Daniel's body lurched upward, his grip on the nightstand sending him sprawling onto the floor. He gasped, chest heaving, the cold vanishing as quickly as it had come. He scrambled backward until his shoulders hit the wall, his wide, unblinking eyes locked on the empty space beneath his bed. Empty. Nothing but shadows. Normal, ordinary shadows. The door creaked open wider and his mother stepped inside, rubbing her eyes. "Daniel? What are you doing on the floor?" His mouth opened, but no words came out. His limbs trembled, his skin clammy with sweat. He wanted to tell her, wanted to scream, to cry, to make her understand. But then he saw it. Just behind his mother, the wardrobe door, open, just a crack. And inside, in the sliver of darkness between the wooden panels, a pair of pale, unblinking eyes, watching, waiting. The house remembered, and it wasn't finished with him yet. The end.